Good evening. So tonight, we're going to be talking about basements, barriers, and beliefs. I'm going to say it again. Basements, barriers, and beliefs. And while those things might seem disparate, in some ways they all mean a great deal to me personally. So I'm starting with basements. It's 1997. I've just moved to New York with a very sizable debt from undergrad and graduate school. I'm sure some of you can relate. And everything I own in the back of a very small rental car, along with a suit that I borrowed from my mom that she FedExed to me to become the executive director of Teach for America, with a fierce and unyielding belief in one thing and one thing alone, that great teachers can have a humongous impact on student achievement, and that not enough poor kids and kids of color have great teachers. By the way, it turns out I was slightly premonition, because we now know that my fierce belief has been backed up with empirical research that shows that great teachers can move young people on average 6 months more than low quality teachers in one academic year. So with that belief, I packed my bags and came to New York City to become the executive director of Teach for America. At that time, I was responsible over the course of 5 years for about 500 teachers in about 150 schools in some of New York City's poorest neighborhoods. And my role was to work with a team of people to support those young people to become the 6-month teachers, as opposed to those who actually kept their young people where they were or actually helped them fall further behind. So I spent a lot of time in New York schools. I took buses, I walked the subway, and I was in schools all the time, at least 3 days a week. And as I was going from school to school, I found myself asking in these behemoth buildings, which we are blessed to have in New York City, hey, what's in the basement? I think I hear children there. Oh yes, that is the program for pregnant and parenting teens. Interesting. Do you run that? I say to the principal. No. That's a district called District 79. All right, keep it moving. Hey, Mr. Principal Y, what's in the basement? Guess what? That's the GED program for kids who dropped out. Do you run that program, Principal Y? No, that's something called District 79. Interesting, keep it moving. Hey, Principal Y, what's in the basement? Well, that's an adult education program for young people who are coming out of incarceration. Do you run that program, Principal Y? No, that's something called District 79. To which I replied, what is this mythical District 79 and who runs it? And why is it the case that the young people who struggle the most, and I would argue have been done such a disservice by our society, are literally and figuratively in the basement with a lack of innovation and, in many instances, some of the lowest quality individuals in the system who couldn't find work elsewhere, and that the large system felt it was acceptable to park with the young people who needed the best. This struck me as grossly unfair and very short-sighted. So I became slightly obsessed with District 79, and I started asking people, who runs it? What is it? How many young people are in this system? And I talked to the chancellor about it. I talked to elected officials about it. And I was naive, figuring that there must be an answer, I just didn't know it. And what it turned out to be is actually a very large system filled with 30,000 young people and 60,000 adults who had been derailed by a system that failed them, many of whom were involved in the child welfare system, in the criminal justice system, in schools and in neighborhoods where schools had failed them, and yet their access back to the system was grossly poor and lacking in innovation and quality. This gave me a tremendous fire in my belly. Now I want to talk to you about belief. I want you to think for a second about where you were when you were 24 years old. For some of you, that was a very long time ago and a distant memory. Of course, I'm not one of those people. Just kidding. But for some of you, that is quite recent. So think about where you were at 24. Perhaps you were in year 6 of college. Perhaps you had graduated and were entering the workforce. Perhaps you had struggled in college and were on the pathway back to academic and therefore economic success. I want to talk to you about where 24-year-olds are in our poorest communities, and particularly in communities of color that have high percentages of poor kids. At 24, 8% of young people living in poor communities have graduated with a bachelor's degree. 8%. Between the ages of 17 and 24, our US citizens that live in our poorest communities only pass basic military exams like the Good Enough Diploma or the GED at 25%. So a quarter of our young people between the ages of 17 and 24 in our poorest communities can pass even the lowest bar of assessments to get into the military, let alone pass things that would get them greater access to economic sufficiency. By the time our young people who are in high school today are 24, do you know how many jobs will be available to them without a post-secondary degree? Even the most optimistic economic theorists think 1 in 5. So by putting them out in the universe, by putting our young people in the universe without the academic skills to excel in college and other post-secondary education, we are dooming them to a life of very limited economic opportunity, and we're doing so willingly. It's an epidemic, and it's one that we endure and allow to exist year after year and day after day. So, what has the reform community done about this really critical question? The answer is absolutely not enough, because even our best schools, our coveted private schools, our exemplary charter schools, our best public schools in suburban neighborhoods have major gaps in achievement between Black and white students, and between students who are living in means and students who are struggling with the effects of poverty. And yet, we ignore this epidemic as if it is not going to hold our country back from greatness. Fast forward. Here we are, and 15 years later, from my initial ill-advised move to New York City, and 7 years from my becoming the superintendent of alternative high schools and programs, the infamous, yes, you heard it, District 79, which after many years of hot pursuit and persistence and trying to understand who actually ran the thing, an entrepreneurial leader called Joel Klein said, well, fine, if you have such a fire in your belly, come fix it. So 7 years later, District 79, a place that I reluctantly left to run Newark Public Schools, has quite a different set of outcomes. In the last 3 years, 150 young people were given and passed Regents tests on Rikers Island. Now, prior to my arrival, thank you. They didn't even give the tests. They literally didn't give them, with the excuse being, well, it's Rikers, we can't actually get the assessments there, to which I responded, well, you can get the GED test there, which is a passport to nowhere, but somehow we can't get the rigorous assessments that give our young people the tools they need to excel in life. 150 young people in the last 3 years have passed those assessments. About 50% of the young people who attend any programs in District 79, including the services for pregnant and parenting teens, including those who are in GED programs, including those who are coming out of incarceration, are making meaningful gains on assessments that we think are quite rigorous, at least half. And we're not at 100%, and I still say we, even though I'm not there, but 50% is a great improvement from where they were. On top of it, the passing rate on the GED, which the young people call the good enough diploma, and I'm not sure how many of you know, but that assessment was actually written in World War II to help returning veterans get a passport to doing something in an economy that was a long time ago, and that it has not been rewritten, and yet we somehow offer that as an alternate diploma that is not really a passport or a pathway to anything in terms of economic justice. So in terms of the GED rate, we said, you shouldn't just pass it here because we know that doesn't get you an entrance into college or into the military anymore. You have to pass it here. And as a result, the passing rate on the GED in District 79 has climbed almost 200 points since I started 7 years ago. So these are not outcomes that we should rest and celebrate entirely. These are major gains. These are things that people in District 79 found previously unthinkable, but they are still wholly inadequate if we are to truly have a just society where everyone has access to the American dream. But let me tell you a little bit about how we got there. And I'm going to take another alliteration leap here, and I'm going to talk about 4 R's. It has to do with relevance. So research shows that young people who have struggled have every ability to access their God-given and their innate qualities of resilience, okay? And this has to do with really tapping in to their ability to have an impact on their own world and on society. So the first R is relevance. There is a ton of research to show that when young people feel as if they're having an impact, they stay in the game, and they have every ability to do so. The second R is resilience. There's an entire field on achievement, motivation, and risk and resilience that tends to stay in the child welfare space and has all too little discussion in the K-12 reform space. And what that space tells us is that there are characteristics that every young person has innate in them: the ability to problem solve, the ability to learn from mistakes, the ability to have a positive outlook, to display grit, as Paul Tufts' book recently has written about. Those things are innate. And everything about school and K-12 literally beats it out of young people. And in particular, it beats it out of young people who happen to be people of color and those who struggle the most. But we know that resilience is something that is truly natural for all young people and can be taught, just like you can teach multiplication or decimals. And these are things we taught in District 79. We had a curriculum about this. We measured it. We looked to see how well teachers were doing it. These are the types of things that help young people get ahead and should be taught in school. And we must believe that it can be done. The third thing, relationships. So this sounds so sophomoric and so absolutely obvious, it's hard to believe we miss this. But there's a lot of research to show that young people who struggle, they get back on their feet when they think there is one caring adult that sees them, that really sees them, that notices them. Not when they're messing up, but also notices what makes them tick, what they're great at, when they're their best selves, and how they can actually contribute to the world. And they say things like, this primary person, or this advocate counselor, or this peer coach, or this mentor, whoever it is, sees me. They really see me, not just when I'm doing something bad, but they also believe in me, and they actually make me believe when even I am doubting. And who among us doesn't need that? But we know that our young people who struggle the most are actually those who need that primary person the most. And so the power of relationships was a critical part of our success in District 79. And rigor. So we know when we set high expectations, folks actually rise to the occasion of the expectations we set. And so we always have this perspective that, well, this person is struggling with life outcomes or court involvement or family issues, and therefore we should remediate. Remediate is the enemy of the kind of work we did in District 79. We need acceleration. We need to believe. And when you expose young people to curricula and texts and complex problems and things that matter, they rise to the occasion. Even if they are struggling with the phonics and the reading, which you must dig in and teach, you cannot do so without respecting their intellect and the fact that many of them are displaying tremendous bouts of leadership, sometimes for the wrong outcomes, but with a little bit of tweaking and high expectations can actually get them where they want to go. With those 4 R's, District 79's outcomes soared. They began to make leaps, which brings me to my third B. I wonder why we aren't doing more of this more systemically. And my hypothesis is I'm not sure we truly believe it's possible. And there are times when I wonder if we want it to happen, because schools in some ways have been the worst enemy of this problem. We suspend African American students at 3 times the rate we suspend white students. We know that if you are suspended in school, you are more than 60 times more likely to be involved, court involved, for the rest of your life. 70% of the students who are arrested as a result of a school-based incident are African American. So in many ways, schools and the way in which we do schooling have to look in the mirror if we are to truly crack this nut. And we must ask ourselves, if we truly believe, we have to look at things like zero tolerance policies that make us act as if we're addressing safety, when in fact we are dooming young people to a life of poor outcomes. We must examine our curricula to ensure that it reflects the diversity of our students. We must think about how we train teachers and whether cultural competence and the notion of how we meet young people where they are is taught. We must look at how we train principals to say, do they have the skill set to truly teach young people skills around resilience? Do we have the skill set to partner with families that may be non-traditional? A young person comes to mind that I met in District 79, a gentleman I'll call Jose, who was actively participating in school when his mother's drug addiction sent him in a downward spiral and actually created a real serious addiction in him as well. And then that led to dealing, which led to arrests. I had a long conversation with Jose, who was attending school in a drug treatment center that District 79 ran. Jose's conversation with me went like this. So Jose, who is invested in you being different when you get out? Because there are a lot of people invested in you being who you were when you got in. And I want you to think about that person now, because the time to actually think about that person and to recruit them to your plan is not when you run into trouble when you get out. To which he replied, it's kind of tough because my mom's still using. What a horrible thing for a young person to have to deal with. It's still your mom. I encouraged him to use the therapeutic community he was in to think about how are you going to embrace her as your mom while also embracing your recovery. But Jose, who else supports you on the out when you're out to be someone different? Who is that? To which he replied, Sally. He knew exactly what I was talking about. Turns out Sally is the mom of his best friend, his next door neighbor. To which I replied, well, how can you get in touch with Sally now to create a plan and proactively think through all the things that might set you back when you get out? Jose said to me, well, Sally's not my mom, she's not on the visitors list. Do we believe that Sally can actually help Jose? Do we believe that kids like Jose can actually get ahead? Do we believe this? If we do, our policies, our advocacy, our training, our support would look so different. It would look so different. And I would argue we would be a better country because our boardrooms, the heads of our higher ed institutions, the heads of our school systems, the heads of our corporations, the White House, they would represent the diversity of this country if we truly believed. So with that, I leave you with the question of belief, and I ask you to never forget that in basements all over this country are young people that deserve a group of adults who never forget. Have a good night.